Dear subscribers, as you know, we shared many information for you, and we are studying very hard to find current news for you. However, I cannot use this channel for future. Please follow our new channel called as Daily News Report and watch our video to support us. Link in description. Also, you can reach the video we shared on Daily News Report by clicking on the top right button. We highly recommend watching, subscribing, and sharing. We will continue to share some news on this channel, but we take precautions against some situations for future. Thank you for supporting us.
Well, that's an excellent question. And a lot of people think that one reason they have to raise rates is to maintain their credibility. In other words, if the economy is doing as well as they claim it is, then they should have to raise interest rates, what they call normalize them, like let them come back up to something approaching a more normal level, which is not zero. And if they can't do that, then it undermines their claim the economy's doing well. So they're kind of in a double bind. If they don't raise rates, then their claim that the economy is healthy is undermined. And if they raise rates, then of course a lot of people feel that that's going to negatively impact the economy. So they're kind of in a double bind, which is why everybody is so focused on this meeting. My approach is a little different. I think those are valid points and so on, but I think that what really counts in the big picture is your currency, because if your currency is devaluing, like losing value, then everybody that owns your currency is their purchasing power of their money is declining, and we call this inflation. But it's actually a loss of purchasing power. That to me is the more accurate thing. In other words, you go out and you can't buy as much with your money if your currency is losing value. So everybody that's lowered their interest rates to zero or negative interest rates, they're actually trying to devalue their currency so that their exports to the rest of the world will become cheaper. And so this is actually a strategy that seems to have it's very short term. In other words, if you destroy the value of your money, your gain in exports is not going to offset all the losses that everybody else that's not part of the export sector is experiencing as your currency loses value. So if you want to have a strong economy, you need a strong currency that's actually increasing in value, that's purchasing power is going up, because then you can buy more stuff, from the rest of the world. So that's kind of the basis of my opinion. And not too many people seem to think through that. They always think, oh, the weaker dollar is going to be great because we can sell some more widgets overseas or something. But that overlooks the fact that the exports are maybe 15% of the economy. So what they're really talking about is punishing 85% of the economy so 15% can pick up a mild gain. That's a really poor cost-benefit ratio.
Do you think them raising the rates at this point, whatever it's going to be, do you see this having an effect on certain sectors of the economy, maybe housing, maybe the stock market, bonds? Do you see any of this being where there's some type of trouble brewing if they decide to do this?
Well, that's a great topic, and of course everybody's wondering that same thing. And I don't claim to be an expert in like the repo market and this sort of high finance techniques that the Fed proposes to use to actually push rates higher. And why this is of interest is a lot of people who follow finance are skeptical that the Fed can actually raise rates. I mean, they can raise the interbank rate and the Fed funds rate and these levers that they control, but they don't actually control the interest rate that say banks will issue mortgages at, or the yield on money markets. And the overall economy is influenced by more things than just the Fed funds rate. And so a lot of people are saying that the Fed can't really push rates higher unless they withdraw liquidity or reduce the amount of credit that's available and actually kind of tighten or restrict the sort of pool of capital that supports the economy, lending and all of that. So that raises a key point. Like maybe the Fed raises their Fed funds rate, but interest rates don't actually go up because the world is awash in capital seeking a return, seeking a yield. And so if there's money just laying around in vast quantities, then they may not be able to push it higher. If they do push it higher, I'm sort of the opinion, the skeptics sort of view that is a 1/4% really going to be so deadly? And it would only be deadly to an extremely fragile system. Because, if I could qualify for a mortgage at 4%, I should be able to qualify at 4.25. If I can't qualify at 4.25, I really have no business buying a house in the first place.
I mean, we saw the interest rates back in 2000, prior to 2008, start to creep up, and a lot of people out in California were just dumping their homes because I think a lot of them had the adjustable rate mortgages, and the whole thing started to basically have a domino effect where things just rapidly fell apart at that point. And I think this is what people are worried about, is if they do raise the rates, those people, like you said, if they're going for a mortgage and they can afford 4%, they should afford 4.25%. But a lot of these people, maybe they have no business really going for any type of housing, because we know Fannie, Freddie, and a lot of the banks right now, they're bringing in people with 0% down, and they're changing a lot of the mortgage qualifications just to bring more people into the market. And it might have an effect on all of these people. And maybe this is something that they're worried about.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and that I think we can look at the same phenomenon you just described in subprime auto loans,
Right.
where if you're depending more and more on marginal borrowers to buy your stuff and to support the economy, then you're taking on an awful lot of risk, because of course the more marginal the borrower, the more likely it is they'll default. And so I think you've raised a key point here that maybe we should talk about, which is the element of risk, and that the more you depend on marginal borrowers and debt, the riskier the system becomes. And this is exactly what you described with housing, that when the last 10% of buyers are using no money down and they're living paycheck to paycheck, then they're the ones that will default the first time that their hours are cut, or someone gets laid off, or they have a medical emergency. And then those defaults act as a domino. And I think we can also see that same effect in high yield bonds, which are called junk bonds, because they have a high yield because they're risky. And so, say if a treasury is paying 2% interest per year and a junk bond's paying 9%, well, the reason why it's paying 9% is there's a chance that company that issued that bond could default, and the person who owns that bond could get nothing. Or they could get some, fraction of their capital back and no interest at all. And so the more that people are buying these junk bonds to get that high interest rate, they're actually taking on an enormous amount of risk that the market doesn't really price in if everybody's looking at the Fed rates and the other central bank rates of basically zero. In other words, people go, oh, well, the system is safe because the central banks have our back and they can always keep interest rates low and all this stuff. But the reality is that those junk bonds are very risky, and people are starting to sell those en masse as they realize that the risk is higher than what is generally understood.
Yes, and we see there's cracks in the junk bond market. And I also noticed that a lot of the insiders are also selling their corporate stocks, even though the corporations are continually doing the buybacks. I noticed there's a lot of insiders who are getting rid of their stocks right now, and they might realize that maybe this market is at its peak right now, and they want to get out before things start to really fall apart.
Yeah, exactly. And who better to know the inside financial health of a company than the insiders? And so, and I think another factor here that is underappreciated is the systemic fragility that we've created here with zero interest rates and a highly speculative economy based on borrowing money to that at almost, if you're a financier or a corporation, you can borrow money for almost nothing, and 1% or less, and then if you find something that yields 2 or 3 or 4%, then it makes sense to go borrow immense sums of money and say buy back the shares of the company, or go buy an apartment building and raise the rents without actually improving the property. And these are my two favorite examples of what's been done with all this cheap money that the Fed has made available to financiers and corporations. Now, if you or I want to go buy something on a credit card, if our credit's not that great, we're still paying 18-19%, right?
Right.
So that's the other thing, is that creating money at almost 0%, it's actually weighted to like the top 0.01% of the economy. In other words, if we were a corporation, we could borrow $100 million at almost nothing and buy back our corporate shares, and that it wouldn't cost us much to do that. Or we could go borrow a huge amount of money, buy an apartment complex, and raise the rents. And these are key examples to me of what's wrong with the economy and what's wrong with what the Fed's been doing, which is fueling speculative borrowing that isn't creating any new jobs. In other words, if I spend $100 million on stock buybacks, I didn't create a single job, not one. If I go buy, 1,000-unit apartment complex and raise the rents 10%, I didn't create a single new job there either.
Right.
So that's where I think the system is becoming more and more fragile. And I think that if what's going to be crimped by that 0.25%, interest increase, or say a slow rise back up to say 1%, what's going to be crimped is all the speculative borrowing, not the guy that or the gal with a job who's buying normal stuff. That's not going to really impact them 0.25% one way or the other, but it's going to make a lot of speculative borrowing and speculative carry trades suddenly really risky, and perhaps even losers that have to be dumped. And so what we're really talking about is, to what degree is our economy now dependent on speculative bubbles and frenzy? And if you say, well, we're really not that dependent on speculative bets, then we should do fine. Interest rates could go up a couple percent, and it wouldn't kill the economy. But if we're really dependent on speculative excess, then that's what's going to be killed by a slightly higher interest rate.
And what's funny and interesting is that they keep talking about raising the interest rates, and Europe, they're negative. And then we hear talk here in the United States, some of the Fed officials are continually saying, well, we might be looking at negative rates. And it seems like it's kind of the opposite of what they've been talking about. And it makes no sense, actually.
Yeah, and I guess the conventional thinking, apparently, as I understand it, is negative interest rates will push us all to spend whatever cash we have. That's the idea, right? To boost the economy, drain every bit of savings, money markets, take money out of your IRA and go buy a new car or whatever. And but this, if we follow that through, that line of thinking, aren't we sacrificing financial security and the longer term interests of the economy for like this short term, higher sales this quarter, and I think that's the real danger in this sort of negative interest rate. Number one, not only is it destroying the return on savings, which used to boost the income of the middle class, right? People used to make 5-6%. This was the historic return on savings, which over time, you doubled your money every 7 to 10 years, and it was an important source of income for retirees and major parts of the middle class. Well, now that's zero, right? We all get like 0.01% on our savings, and so that's actually drained hundreds of billions of dollars of income from the middle class. And so that's one downside to negative interest rates. And the other one is when what you're really doing is you're cheapening capital you're basically saying capital is now worthless. There's an overabundance of it. Any financier can go borrow, and basically banks can create endless amounts of financial capital. And so that distorts the value of assets. Like suddenly everybody can go borrow money at almost no cost, and then you get asset bubbles. And so then that distorts the economy in ways that you can't really control once they've taken off. And so then that's how we've gotten this boom and bust every 7 or 8 years cycle, which is devastating to the middle class again, and the working class people that don't have access to $100 million at 1%. The booms and busts actually reduce like household wealth, and we can see that household wealth has never recovered. The median household wealth has never recovered from the 2007-2008 global financial meltdown.
Now, I want to switch gears here a little bit. You wrote an article about the American dream and how it's over, where the people, they're not really believing that the economy is better, that, retail is doing well, unemployment is down 5%. So why is the American dream over?
Okay, well, this is an excellent topic, and I think we're talking about a couple different factors here. One is our intuitive sense that opportunity has declined. And for example, it used to be, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, if you got a college degree, even if it wasn't in something like computer science, you were almost guaranteed some sort of like decent living wage and some financial security. And now everybody realizes that the economy is a lot more contingent, and you can't really count on those things anymore. And college degrees no longer have a lot of scarcity value. I mean, there's tens of millions of people with the same kind of degrees, and so the sense of certainty that people used to take for granted is missing. That's sort of an intuitive sense. And then, statistically, we can see that household wealth is declining and wages have stagnated for decades. Even at the highest level of people with advanced degrees, they're not getting ahead anymore either. They're simply hanging on. While everyone below that, the highest level, say the top 5 or 10% of the economy, everyone else is actually losing wages if we adjust for inflation. So I think what we're really talking about is to go back to Karl Marx's insight into capitalism. And of course we know that his theory was flawed in terms of what would replace capitalism, and there's a lot of I'm not claiming that Marx was correct in everything he wrote or saw in 1860, but I think that his basic concept was there's an ownership class, people who own capital, right? And then there's the labor class, people who actually perform the labor and create value, with the capital that's owned by somebody else, the ownership class. And what the American dream was that you would actually become part of the ownership class. You would own a house free and clear that you could pass on to your kids, and then they would become wealthier because they didn't have to pay, a mortgage. You could start a small business and pass that on to your kids. You could accumulate some savings and have an actual retirement. All these things are part of the ownership, and so that's why the political leadership often refers to the ownership society. But ownership doesn't just mean you own a truck or a car or a boat, or you own 10% of a house and the bank owns 90%. It's ownership of assets, productive assets that generate income, and that's where I think the core of what's eroding is people's ability to acquire a productive asset is dramatically declining. And one reason is the Fed policy has created these asset bubbles, so no one can afford a house, or it's so expensive that you become a debt serf. And I've often talked about higher education as a bloated, inefficient cartel, and we see the same thing there. That it used to be that you could go to college and it might cost the equivalent of a car. Say if a car costs $20,000 today or $25,000, that was the cost of an entire college education, 4 years, right? Now the cost is $100,000, $150,000 and up, and then people get behind on their college student loans, and then the penalties, and it's $250,000. I mean, insane amounts. In other words, now it's the cost of a house to go to college, and yet the tools of education have become cheaper, like online courses and so it doesn't make any sense. And so in terms of the cost of education should be declining rapidly, not leaping rapidly. So in terms of being the American dream, it used to be you could afford to get an education that would secure you a foothold in the ownership society. And that is what's eroded. And so everyone's left being a laborer. And so in a way, we're returning to the sort of what I call neo-feudal form of capitalism, where the vast majority of people are marginalized and dispossessed, or they're living a very contingent life. Like they're one crisis away from losing everything. And that's completely different than what people presumed was the American dream in the golden decades.
I guess this is why the labor participation rate has plunged. I mean, we're seeing more and more people not working at this point. And I don't think it's their choice not to work. I think it's getting harder and harder to find that job. I mean, I know a lot of college graduates who have graduated, and a lot of them are working part-time jobs. They're not even working in their majors. They can't find work. And a lot of people are going to college today they don't even know what they're going for anymore. And they're coming out of college with this piece of paper, and there's just nothing out there. But they have these student loans, thousands and thousands of dollars, and they're being, modified by the government to help them pay these back because they, I guess, base it on their income now. But we're seeing the labor participation rate, it's completely falling apart.
Right, and that matters because all of our social network of like Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare, all of our federal pensions and health care services and social welfare, all of these are pay-as-you-go, pardon me, pay-as-you-go systems, meaning that there's no pool of money that's been saved up to pay people their Social Security checks or their Medicare costs. It's the current workers paying taxes today are paying the Social Security and Medicare costs of retirees today. And so what that means is if the economy, once upon a time, there were about 7 or 8 workers for every retiree. Well, so obviously, those workers didn't have to pay too much tax to support that one retiree. But now, because the participation rate's declining while the baby boom is retiring, it's down to 2.5 workers for every retiree. And so the workers have to pay a lot more tax. Somebody has to pay a lot more tax in order to support those costs. And so there's a demographic issue here, that is often lost. In other words, we have a lot more retirees, and healthcare costs are soaring. And then the people who are working have, as you say, high student loan debt, and they have to pay a lot of tax. At least once you start making what used to be considered a middle class income, you're starting to pay a lot of tax. And so the other side of this is automation. In other words, if you're in business, you're looking to cut your labor costs, because labor costs are often the biggest component of your production cost. And the reason why this was it's not just the wage, it's the overhead. In other words, the labor overhead. It's like the workers' compensation, it's the Social Security tax paid by the employer, it's healthcare costs, it's all those things that the employee doesn't see, those are going up all the time. So to the employer, he may not be raising any his wages that he's paying, but he's seeing his labor costs go up. And so there's a lot of elements here pushing down the opportunity for jobs, and the participation rate is reflecting those factors, including the difficulty in starting your own business. You know, that there's a lot of regulatory burdens, there's a lot of what I call junk fees. And so it's harder and harder to open a small business or even be self-employed. And so that's another part of the loss of the American dream, is you used to be able to go, you know what, I'm sick of working for, corporate America or the government. I'm going to go off and be self-employed. And that's become much more difficult.
No, I agree with you. And in your book, your new book, A Radically Beneficial World, you had a statement in there, and I thought that was quite powerful. Because we see a lot of people, who are on these social programs. We know the government, is borrowing a lot of money from the Fed, creating this huge amount of debt. And your statement is, guaranteed income lacks purpose, sources of pride, community, and meaning. It offers no way to create a value or build capital, and so it is nothing but a modern form of serfdom. And this, to me, is very powerful, because it seems like this is what they're trying to. It looks like this is what they're trying to create. That we are completely dependent on the government, and if we're dependent on the government, we do not build anything. There's no value. There's nothing except being serfs.
I think you're absolutely right, and that's not what humans are made to do. In other words, humans need a purpose. They need a sense of meaning. We're social animals. So we want to feel valued within a community or organization, and so just paying everybody, $1,000 or $1,200 to stay at home and do nothing, it's really debilitating. And I am astonished that the sort of upper middle class pundits that dominate the media, that they don't think this through at all. The vast majority of them think that the answer to this decline of work and automation and so on is to just pay everybody a guaranteed minimum wage, if you will, or a minimum income, even if they're not working. But they don't think through the consequences of this for the individual who's basically been robbed of all opportunity, and dependence doesn't feel good. In other words, we don't feel delighted and grateful if we're getting a basic sort of minimal survival stipend from the government. We're not feeling overjoyed by that. We're looking at everybody who still has a job and opportunity. We're looking at them with resentment. And on the flip side, the people who are seeing their taxes go higher and higher and higher to pay for all this social welfare, they're resenting, the fact that they're getting less and less of their own earnings because they've got to support everybody that isn't working. And so I think it's clear what we need to do is provide guaranteed work, paid work, not guaranteed income. We need to provide people with an opportunity to contribute and to build capital, and not just financial capital, but social capital, which means your skill sets and your networks of connections, and what makes you feel good about going to work.
And also in your book, you said something about, and I know we touched upon this in the beginning, but you said money creation, there's no connection with job creation. And we've seen this since 2008, where they're continually creating all of this money with, or I should say currency, with QE. And there really is no correlation to creating jobs, because we haven't really seen more jobs. I know the unemployment rate has come down, but a lot of that is manipulated. But we're not really seeing the good, high-paying, manufacturing type of jobs at all. Do you see any of that?
No, as from what I gather, most of the jobs that have been created are contingent sort of service jobs, bartenders, waiters, that kind of thing in the service sector, that don't pay that well and have very little security. And so you're not going to build a middle class life on a part-time or low-pay service job. And that's the downside of the way that we create money. And so my basic position is, if we don't change the way we create and distribute money, we haven't changed anything. All we've done is just kind of play around the edges. And so right now, as we all know, money is created by central banks and by too big to fail banks, that can basically create money out of thin air when they originate a mortgage or some other loan, through fractional reserve lending, right? If you have $1 of cash, then you can loan out $10. All that money's created at the top of the wealth pyramid, right? And then it's distributed at the top of the wealth pyramid. And so from my point of view, we're assuming that there's some sort of magic that it trickles down and creates jobs. But as we've discussed today, actually what makes sense if you're a financier or a corporate manager is you go borrow all this money that's been created out of thin air, and then you go buy an asset. You overpay for it, but you don't care because your money, the money's free. That doesn't create a single job at all. And so there's really no connection between creating money at the top of the pyramid like we do now and creating jobs. And so what I propose is, why don't we create money at the bottom of the pyramid and pay people who are actually doing useful work in their community? And this requires creating money outside of central banks, because central banks, of course, are the top of the pyramid. And they exist to serve banks and the political elite. So they're never going to create money at the bottom of the pyramid. And so what I propose is let's create a new kind of currency that only is distributed to those people that are actually creating value in their community. And that's the basis of guaranteed paid work, as opposed to guaranteed serfdom.
So for my last question here, where are we headed right now with the economy, with the central banking system, with this debt? Can they continually keep this going the way it is, or is something going to break, and is it going to break soon?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it's on a lot of people's minds. And I would start with, there's a moral aspect to this that we often overlook. And the moral aspect is, when the federal government borrows trillions of dollars that the Federal Reserve just created, right? We're actually borrowing it from our grandkids, because we know that debt's never going to be paid back. And no matter how low the interest rate, right now it's around, I think it's around 2.75% for a 30-year treasury. That interest has to be paid by our grandkids and then their kids, and it's going to be paid forever. And so we're creating this mountain of debt that is basically robbing our grandkids of their own earnings, because now, instead of being able to use their earnings in the future, they're going to have to siphon off a huge percentage of that to pay interest so that we can consume something today. And that is morally wrong. And yet nobody talks about that, because if we stopped borrowing trillions from our grandkids, the system would implode. And everybody knows that. But to me, it's wrong to borrow from the future people. And if the system implodes, then it deserves to implode. And we're going to have to reorder things to live on less. Less debt, less income, and tighten our belts, or reorganize bloated, inefficient cartels. There's a lot of things we can do, and that doesn't mean life is going to end. It actually would be an improvement to get by on less, use less. And this is part of what we call the degrowth movement. In other words, instead of depending on permanent growth of debt to support permanent growth of consumption, that we would actually have degrowth, like use less of everything, and that would be easier on the planet, and it would not require this vast expansion of debt. So that's one thing I think we should think about, is we have a moral duty to our kids, grandkids, and their kids, and nobody wants to talk about that. The other thing is, eventually debt does eat itself alive, if you will. In other words, interest eats the system from within. And the lower you push interest rates, the longer you can keep the system apparently alive. And Japan's a living proof, right? For 25 years, they've been borrowing immense sums of money to keep their system afloat. So, and to the surprise of many of us, it seems like it's almost permanent. But history suggests that permanence is a matter of decades, not hundreds of years. And so I think there will be a grand crisis where the foundation of all this debt, collateral and income to pay taxes. Once the collateral and the income start shrinking, then the debt is unsupportable, and then it basically implodes, and it has to be written down, forgiven, or paid back with hyperinflated money, which is just another form of collapse.
Charles, thank you for coming on the X22 Report Spotlight. Can you tell everyone how they can get your book?
Please visit me at of2minds.com.